The year 1937 was a difficult one for the Peace Mission movement. Founded by a leader known as Father Divine, the organization gained notoriety in the 1920s for hosting Holy Communion Banquets in Saville, New York. Holy Communion Banquets were dinners hosted by Father Divine and his followers, featuring singing, sermons, and a variety of the finest foods. When the Great Depression began, the Peace Mission movement's membership surged. Members like John the Revelator and Faithful Mary used their personal testimonies to publicize Father Divine's purported power around the country. People were fascinated by Father Divine's ability to host lavish feasts, grow his religious following, and start businesses without ever publicly soliciting donations. His followers believed that Father Divine was God. The movement eventually relocated from Saville to Harlem and established a headquarters at 20 West 115th Street, which they called Heaven One. Several movement businesses were located nearby. But in 1937, the Peace Missions movement's rise hit several speed bumps. Former members filed civil lawsuits demanding a return of donated items. When 3 men attempted to serve a legal summons to Father Divine, a fight broke out. 2 of the men were injured and another one was stabbed. Father Divine fled the scene, but was found days later hiding in a Peace Mission location in Connecticut. During the time of his disappearance, Faithful Mary defected and created her own splinter group. She wrote a book claiming that Father Divine sexually abused and financially exploited his members. Fights and several suspected arsons occurred as followers of Faithful Mary and Father Divine fought each other. John the Revelator caused more bad publicity for the organization when he was charged and convicted for violations of the Mann Act. After leading a missionary meeting in Colorado on behalf of Father Divine, John seduced the 17-year-old daughter of a local couple and took her to New York. It seemed like matters couldn't get any worse until another famous religious leader learned about Father Divine. Known by his followers as Daddy Grace, he was personally offended by the fact that Father Divine claimed to be God. By 1938, he was in a position to show the strength of his movement. Unbeknownst to many outsiders, the so-called secret to Father Divine's success was that he had absolutely no assets in his name. Instead, his followers owned or leased properties. They were also free to individually or cooperatively operate Peace Mission businesses. The Peace Mission movement operated under Father Divine's influence without any legally recognized structure. Now, with the many scandals in the news and members defecting, Daddy Grace saw an opportunity. Grace's real estate advisor confirmed that the Peace Mission movement was leasing their headquarters building, but the owner of the building was interested in selling it. After a visit to the property, Grace signed a purchase agreement the same day. He went public with the purchase and announced that he would be evicting Father Divine's movement from the building and establishing his own organization's headquarters in its place. The media went wild. The clash of 2 influential, non-mainstream Black leaders was too much to ignore. Father Divine tried to appear unfazed. He told reporters that the sale had occurred, quote, according to his own instruction and according to his own endorsement, end quote, and that he bore no ill will towards the purchaser. He was careful never to mention Daddy Grace's name explicitly. Further reporting actually revealed that a counteroffer submitted by one of Father Divine's followers had been rejected. Daddy Grace was less ecumenical. "Go explain to your flock how come God Almighty can be evicted," he declared. On Wednesday, June 1st, the Peace Mission movement was evicted. Father Divine was noticeably absent. He had 2 appearances planned at other Peace Mission locations, but did not mention the eviction at all in his speeches that day. Daddy Grace watched the eviction take place and spoke to the press. As Peace Mission members moved property from the building, they stopped and took a look at the man who had evicted God from heaven. You are watching Black Belief. Be sure that you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that you never miss a new video. Marcelino Manuel de Graça was born in Cape Verde on January 25, 1881. Cape Verde is a country off the coast of West Africa made up of 10 major islands. Portugal mapped the islands in 1460, during a period when the country was colonizing the African mainland. The slave trade was a profitable business for the country, but slave buyers feared stepping foot on the mainland due to disease and resistance from indigenous people. Eventually, Portugal used Cape Verde as a slave staging area. Enslaved people were brought to the islands, taught Catholicism and a little Portuguese, and then put up for sale. Buyers were willing to pay a premium to buy slaves that were already so-called domesticated. Portugal granted land and trading privileges to Portuguese citizens who used slave labor to grow crops. Over time, many slaves were freed for economic reasons, after which they usually remained in the same jobs, but would no longer depend on their master for their living expenses. As the free population grew, intermarriage led to the rise of a mixed-race population. The various phenotypes amongst the population led to a rise of a complex class system. Class in Cape Verde was not merely a matter of income, but was also dependent on which island someone lived on, their educational level, religion, skin tone, hair texture, and nose shape. There were many terms used to differentiate between the different groups. In the 1856 census, for example, 17 choices were available in reference to skin color. The only consistent categorization was that of enslaved people who were at the bottom of society and that of white Portuguese people who were at the top. This system was very different from the racial system in the United States, which operated according to the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule categorizes any person with one black ancestor as black, regardless of their appearance. The southernmost island of Cape Verde is Brava, the island where de Graça was born. The island historically had a higher proportion of white Portuguese residents, and many of the mixed-race residents had lighter skin tones, lighter eye colors, and straighter hair. Religiously, Cape Verde was dominated by various forms of Catholicism, which was synchronized with African religions. The first Protestant church formed on Brava was the Pentecostal Mission of Brava. Immigration from the island started in the early 1800s and hit its peak well in the early 1900s. Portugal had failed to improve life for residents beyond what was needed to maintain their colonial system, so local economic opportunities were scarce. Due to their willingness to accept less pay than American citizens, Cape Verdeans became a popular labor force for shipping companies. Immigrants who left for the United States were able to send money back home to help their families and improve Cape Verde's infrastructure. In May of 1902, the immigration wave brought the de Graça family to New Bedford, Massachusetts. The father of the family was Manuel de Graça and his wife's name was Gertrude. The children who traveled with them were Eugenia, age 20, Sylvia, age 12, Benventura, age 14, and Louise, age 6. A 22-year-old Marcelino Manuel de Graça arrived alone later on, claiming he was joining his father. The number and names of children associated with the family and records vary. Friends often traveled with immigrant families and listed themselves as family members because it increased their chances of entry. It's also difficult to know much about the family's early years in America because de Graça was an extremely common name among Cape Verdean immigrants. The de Graças settled in. The racial system in the United States led white Portuguese immigrants to feel they were completely separate from other Cape Verdeans. In response, the non-white immigrants from the islands established their own churches within Catholicism and Protestantism. They took jobs in agriculture and other low-wage areas. Marcelino was no exception. After a short stint as a seasonal cranberry picker, he moved into the sales business, selling patent medicines and groceries. At 28, he married Jane Jenny Lombard, another Cape Verdean. Jenny was 17 years old at the time. The pair had 2 children, Irene and Norman. Marcelino continued working odd jobs, barely bringing in enough income to support the family. In 1913, Jenny claimed that Marcelino deserted the family. Records show that he later filed for divorce in 1920 on grounds of alleged adultery on Jenny's part. Between 1913 and 1919, Marcelino traveled around the country supporting himself with various menial jobs and experimenting with different religious sects. Eventually, he Americanized his name, changing it to Charles M. Grace. He established his first house of prayer in West Wareham, Massachusetts in 1919. He traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts and led religious meetings in rented spaces throughout 1920. In December of 1921, Charles, who was then known as Bishop Grace, founded the New Bedford House of Prayer. Other churches like the AME Zion Church and the Bethel AME Church were already established in the neighborhood. These churches were more traditional and hierarchical. They held services only on Sundays. Bishop Grace held services of his church daily, with his longest service occurring on Sundays. Neighbors soon became alarmed at the daily loud worship music coming from the new church. Some complained to the police. At least one church nearby relocated shortly after the House of Prayer opened its doors. Bishop Grace and his House of Prayer seemed to be something entirely different from the religious movements that had come before it. In truth, this new church blended the teachings of two older movements, holiness and Pentecostalism. In the early 19th century, the holiness movement emerged in opposition to the established churches, which required credentialed clergy and appealed to a largely middle-class membership. In Christian theology, there are two spiritual processes, or two works of God's grace, that lead to a person's salvation. The first is called justification, which happens when a person repents of their sins, accepts Jesus Christ as their Savior, and are forgiven for their sins. Justification doesn't necessarily mean that a person will not or cannot sin again. The second work of grace is called sanctification, where God changes a person inwardly so that they can no longer have a sinful nature. While almost all Christians believe in these two processes, they disagree about how and when they occur. The holiness movement believed in a doctrine called entire sanctification. In their view, a saved person would experience instantaneous spiritual, complete sanctification. When a person was fully sanctified, their impulse to sin was removed and their lifestyle and habits were pure. When a person was sanctified, they would also be filled with the Holy Spirit. Holiness groups had strict requirements regarding conduct and preferred to avoid those who had not been fully sanctified. The Pentecostal movement, however, began in the early 20th century with the Azusa Street Revival. Pentecostals accepted the two works of grace, but added a third one, baptism of the Holy Spirit, demonstrated by speaking in tongues, also known as glossolalia. Pentecostals believed that the gift of speaking in tongues was the only true evidence of sanctification, but they also believed that the removal of sin from a person's life was a gradual process. They saw speaking in tongues as a sign of the end times, a period during which Jesus Christ would return to the earth. Holiness movements didn't necessarily condemn speaking in tongues, but did not believe that speaking in tongues was the only sign of sanctification. The two movements are often confused with each other due to the many sects and splinter groups which incorporate beliefs from both movements. Bishop Grace's House of Prayer was one of these groups. He taught that his congregation was living in the last days, as evidenced by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, which allowed members to speak in tongues. He agreed with Pentecostalism that speaking in tongues was the most important spiritual gift and that sanctification was gradual. It was expected that members may still sin at times and should repent when they did. The rejection of total sanctification meant that even members who had not yet received the gift of speaking in tongues were not necessarily perceived as unsaved. However, similar to the Holiness Church, the House of Prayer avoided interactions with non-members because Bishop Grace taught his church was the only true church. Bishop Grace had a process for establishing churches in any given location. He would send his traveling band to play around a town to advertise his upcoming visit. Band members would then take on full responsibility for reserving a meeting space, providing seating, and gathering supplies for the upcoming event. They would run advertisements for the meeting in the local paper weeks in advance. This arrangement meant that Grace's band had a financial interest in the success of his meetings. In 1926, the bishop launched a tour of the South. In Savannah, Georgia, an ad announcing his upcoming visit claimed that he would be coming from Jerusalem and had the power to heal. At first, reviews were positive. Attendees claimed that Bishop Grace healed lepers, crippled people, and the blind. Local religious leaders took notice. One Savannah Seventh-day Adventist pastor argued that the bishop was both a charlatan taking advantage of the poor, but also an agent of the devil whose power he used to heal. The pastor's research revealed that the bishop was from Cape Verde and not Jerusalem. He further claimed that he had visited all the people who had supposedly been healed, and these people were still sick. He offered a $25 reward to anyone who could find a person who had been permanently healed. Complaints from the pastor led to a brief arrest for Bishop Grace. He quickly made bail and returned to an ongoing meeting the same night. Grace's most successful location was Charlotte, North Carolina, where he earned the nickname Black Christ. Despite the fact that houses of prayer meetings had been held in other locations, followers of Bishop Grace would come to regard June 26, 1926, the day that services first started in Charlotte, as the true beginning of the church. Hundreds of people were baptized in the river, and there were no legal problems. The excitement in Charlotte would be sustained for years to come. At other locations, tragedy struck. In Newport News, Virginia, local leaders were angry at the bishop's interracial meetings. In Seversville, North Carolina, during a mass baptism, one man drowned. Bishop Grace said that during the ceremony, he noticed that a man was struggling and tried to save him. When he couldn't do so and became tired himself, he left the man and returned to the shore. Once on land, he continued to baptize the crowds of people waiting for him. Though no formal legal charges were filed against him, many were shocked at the bishop's seeming indifference to the man's death. Shortly after the incident, Bishop Grace left town. To outsiders, it seemed that he had fled town to escape backlash for the drowning. The church claimed that Grace had left due to his father's sudden death. Throughout 1927, the bishop traveled to the areas that welcomed him and built upon the following he'd attracted the year prior. His detractors called him a con man, a fake, and a hypnotist. His followers simply called him Daddy. The United House of Prayer for All People of the Rock on the Rock of the Apostolic Faith, or House of Prayer for short, opened new locations under the leadership of pastors called elders. Elders were responsible for upholding and enforcing the church's moral teachings. Members were forbidden from drinking, gambling, smoking, dancing, and going to the movie theater. Daddy Grace claimed that he had never watched television. He also forbade his followers from listening to the radio and traveling by airplane. He promoted American patriotism, and although he advocated for world peace, he supported those who served in the military. Women were warned to dress modestly but encouraged to look attractive. Grace taught that female members should have a different dress for every day of the week. They were excluded, however, from theological leadership roles. Still, several key women occupied important positions. Annie Bell Jones was National Headquarters spokesperson. Effie Lawrence was a founding trustee of the church. Mary Alice Boulware was the secretary of Grace magazine for several years. Aside from these and a small number of other examples, women were involved in the less high-profile daily work of running the church. Like mainstream churches, though they made up a plurality of the church membership, they didn't hold the majority of leadership roles. Daddy Grace emphasized that his church was open to all people of any race or gender, but only his church offered the true road to salvation. House of Prayer pastors unabashedly taught that anyone outside the House of Prayer was in danger of eternal hellfire. The organization taught that God ordained a single leader during various biblical eras to lead his people, a doctrine they call one-man leadership. Grace was the final sole authority anointed to make decisions for the movement. Observers immediately wanted to know about Daddy Grace's racial identification. On the island of Brava, Grace probably would have been at the top of the racial ladder due to his fluency in Portuguese, his European phenotype, and his light skin. In the United States, however, Grace was classified as a Negro and placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Despite this, he insisted that America's racial classification didn't affect him. He reported that he had never experienced discrimination or any negative consequences from Jim Crow laws. At times, he identified as a white Portuguese man and avoided telling people he was born and raised in Cape Verde. Other times, he identified as colorless and touted his ability to attract all races to his church. Throughout his life, Grace never openly identified as Black. Instead, he claimed that he was sent to America to help Black people deal with their oppression and discrimination. The term daddy for a spiritual leader is somewhat unique amongst religions in the United States. However, in African cultures, the term is commonly used for men in leadership roles. It's interesting to note that in Catholicism, the religion of Grace's upbringing, the priests are called father. It's clear that Grace's Catholic background was one source of inspiration for how he organized the House of Prayer. Because the members of the House of Prayer were considered children, calling Grace daddy developed as a way of communicating their admiration and respect for their leader. Though he was criticized by mainstream leaders for doing so, Grace also used the title bishop. One of the unique aspects of the House of Prayer was their auxiliaries, which were groups formed around different church activities. Each auxiliary had their own leadership, uniforms, and dues. An auxiliary president would serve a 90-day term and was subject to disciplinary action if caught breaking any of the church's rules. Members could participate in a maximum of 2 auxiliaries and were required to pay dues weekly. Fines would be levied for members who failed to attend meetings or broke a group's rules. Any person who failed to pay fines or dues would be banned from auxiliary participation entirely. Most of these groups focused on fundraising for specific projects. The Elder Board and the Banking Committee were auxiliaries that conducted official church business and were more formal. Other groups like the Home Lovers or the Literature Club were more like social clubs. Every house of prayer was required to have male and female ushers, grace soldiers, and grace maids. Grace soldiers were men who were responsible for escorting Daddy Grace whenever he was in town. Grace maids were single celibate women who would act as Daddy Grace's special assistants when he visited. Another standing auxiliary was the Grace Baby Band, a group of adolescents who traveled and performed at different church locations. There was also the Soul Patrol, an internal drill team. Given that members were expected to attend church daily, Grace wanted his church to be different from what he called long-face religion. Auxiliaries made it enjoyable and easier for members to incorporate the church in their daily lives. Music was another important aspect of the culture. In the early 1930s, a new genre called shout was developed amongst the church's musicians. Shout bands placed an emphasis on sousaphones, drums, and trombones instead of vocalists. The term shout was inspired by the book of Joshua, in which God tells the Israelites that they should circle the city of Canaan while blowing horns. Therefore, shout music represented victory through God's power. On the weekdays, service began in the evening around 7:30 p.m., and each day had a different theme. Monday was a standard service. Tuesday was pastor's night, which meant that the offering collected was reserved for the pastor. On Wednesdays, the church had home builders night, and the collection was reserved for the National Building Fund. Thursdays was called the Young People's Service. The youth were encouraged to perform and present in front of the church. On Fridays, the so-called Mother House of the region held a union service. On Saturday nights, the church held the Floodgate meeting, which focused on prayer. Sometimes the Saturday service would go on so late that people slept in the church until the next day. On Sundays, Sunday school was in the morning, followed by 3 other services throughout that day. The biggest event of the year was Convocation, which marked the end of the previous year and the beginning of the next. Every house of prayer location was required to hold a convocation celebration, and every minister in an area where a congregation was located was expected to contribute to the event financially. Additionally, each member paid a convocation fee. All houses of prayer, no matter how new or old, had the same layout. At first, the sanctuary might appear to be a typical church. Rows of pews face an altar where the pastor's pulpit is located. However, in the house of prayer, the altar is called a holy mountain, a place where only holy men and prophets can ascend. Members were not allowed to approach the holy mountain through the center aisle and could only do so from the side aisles. At the top of the mountain would be an ornate throne reserved for Daddy Grace. Even in churches where Daddy Grace was unlikely to visit, the church kept the throne maintained in perfect condition and covered in plastic, ready for a potential visit. Only the bishop and his assistants were allowed to touch the throne. Nearby was a podium and sections for the choir and the band. A lower tier contained seating for elders and leaders. On the walls, churches hung pictures of properties that the organization had acquired or pictures of Daddy Grace. The color scheme throughout churches was red, white, and blue, which Daddy Grace said were his favorite colors because they matched the American flag. In the back of the church, a placard with a list of auxiliaries and their most recent fundraising totals was placed on the wall. In order to maintain the church's growth, Bishop Grace traveled extensively to locations around the country. In the spring, he visited the biggest congregations like the ones in Newark and Philadelphia. During the summer, he visited different convocations, starting from the Northeast to the Southeast. At the end of the season, he retreated to Los Angeles or Cuba to spend his winters. An observer would note that the attitude about money in the house of prayer was straightforward. Leaders directly asked for donations, reminding members that the church couldn't exist without financial support. Members were happy to oblige and felt a sense of pride at the real estate and business investments the church made from their offerings. This approach was controversial and jarring to mainstream churches, who took pains to separate financial and spiritual matters. In the house of prayer, status was openly conferred on those who donated the highest amounts. Another source of income came from selling products. In the early years of the movement, the primary product advertised by Daddy Grace was his own power to heal. During a visit in Charlotte, he told reporters that only about 1% of people who sought healing from him would receive it. He claimed that the remaining 99% did not have sufficient faith. One of his well-publicized success stories was the alleged resurrection of his own sister from the dead. Many other followers reported their healing stories. One woman from South Carolina claimed that she was able to meet Daddy Grace and explain her condition. She said that Daddy Grace gave her a single peanut and she was healed immediately. The movement had grown so much in the 1930s that Grace was no longer able to perform individual healings. Instead, he began selling blessed handkerchiefs and blessed fabric squares, which people could use at home. Coffee, soap, toothpaste, stationery, and other items were printed with Grace's name or likeness and were marketed to followers as having special properties, even though these products were not explicitly identified as health remedies. Believers could also write letters to Grace and ask him to pray on their behalf. Perhaps the most important product was Grace Magazine, the church's periodical. The publication was used to spread the teachings of the church, provide advice to members about healings, and share important organizational news. The magazine was so revered that many members attributed healing powers to the physical text. One woman reported that she would soak the magazine in water and drink the solution anytime she was sick. This behavior from members, as well as statements reprinted by outsiders, led many to believe that the House of Prayer venerated Daddy Grace as God. This perception was further reinforced by the tendency of members to use Grace's name in the place of God's name in prayers and personal testimonies. For example, one woman stated, "Daddy Grace is my life, health, strength, and my salvation. The more Satan oppresses me, the more Daddy blesses me." Even some elders spoke about the connection between the bishop and the divine, claiming that Daddy Grace was God incarnate. However, there were other leaders that gently corrected or clarified these beliefs. While they conceded that lay members may have become overly enthusiastic and had a deep desire to believe Grace was God, they insisted that this was not the official teaching of the church. Grace referred to himself as a servant of God or God's child. Other times he was non-committal. A reporter once asked him if he was God, to which he answered, "Some people say that I am." The most accurate conclusion is that members believed that Grace had a special status under God and was being used to carry out a special mission on God's behalf. This mission eventually would be threatened by an accusation which raised questions about whether Daddy Grace was living up to the high standards he had set for the members of his church. In 1933, records show that Grace married a woman named Angelina Montana. In March of 1934, a 20-year-old member named Minnie Lee Campbell accused Daddy Grace of sexually assaulting and impregnating her. She alleged that he had transported her across state lines with the explicit purpose of attacking her. As a result, Daddy Grace was charged with violating the Mann Act. The Mann Act, also known as the White Slave Traffic Act, was named after Illinois Congressman James Robert Mann. The law was passed in response to a moral panic in the early 20th century caused by changes in women's rights and immigration. The decline of agriculture and the decreased influence of traditional courting rituals allowed a growing number of women to move to cities where they secured employment and lived independently. At the same time, the increase in immigration meant that men and women from different countries lived side by side in cities where crime, poverty, and vice abounded. Reformers used immigrants as a scapegoat for what they felt were declining morals of native-born white women. Stories of immigrants who kidnapped white women and forced them into prostitution dominated newspapers. Elected officials led by Congressman Mann passed the White Slave Traffic Act in an attempt to show that they were taking action to address the so-called crisis. The law forbade the transportation of women across state lines for the purpose of prostitution, debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose. The phrase "for any other immoral purpose" was so ambiguous that it allowed the law to be used against people who engaged in socially unacceptable but nevertheless consensual activities. Those who had marital affairs, engaged in premarital sex, or tried to be in interracial relationships were often targeted. Boxer Jack Johnson was convicted under the Mann Act in 1913 for allegedly transporting a white prostitute across state lines. However, it's widely accepted that his prosecution was due to outrage over his consensual relationships with white women. In 1944, comedian, actor, and political activist Charlie Chaplin was charged but later acquitted of violations under the Mann Act. Observers believed he was targeted due to his leftist views. The Mann Act in practice was used as a political tool by the government and the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation to target those believed to be a danger to the state. The existence of a widespread industry of white slavery and/or prostitution was never confirmed. In 1932, Minnie was brought to Philadelphia to work as a housekeeper in Grace's home. She claimed that Grace made sexual advances towards her and even tried to rape her on at least one occasion. According to Minnie's testimony, in October of 1932, Grace told her that the House of Prayer in Baltimore was looking for a piano player, and he thought she'd be great for the job. He offered to drive her to the church and get her set up at the new post. During the trip, he eventually revealed that he had hoped the trip would convince her to finally accept his advances. She claimed that he threatened to leave her stranded if she refused. On their way to Baltimore, the pair stopped in Washington, D.C. to spend the night at a House of Prayer boarding house. Minnie was assigned a room with a little girl, while Grace had a private room in the upper floor of the home. Before retiring to their rooms, the bishop allegedly approached Minnie and told her that he would leave his bedroom door unlocked and that he wanted her to come up to his room that night. Fearful of being left in an unfamiliar city and wanting to obey her leader, Minnie complied and allowed Grace to have sex with her. He later transported her to Baltimore, where she was given the job as the piano player. She soon found out that she was pregnant and gave birth to a son whom she named Charles N. Campbell in July of 1933. She claimed that Grace was the only man she had ever been intimate with. Grace testified that he first met Minnie through her older sister named Lucille Campbell, a member of the House of Prayer in Brooklyn, New York. According to him, in November of 1932, he received a telegram from Lucille requesting that he come to Brooklyn to mediate a dispute. She requested that Grace bring her sister Minnie with him. Grace claimed that this trip was the first time he had ever met Minnie. When Grace and Minnie arrived in Brooklyn, Lucille accused her sister and two other female church members of engaging in a sexual relationship. Grace presided over an internal church trial to determine whether the allegations were true. He found the women guilty. Lucille asked if Grace could help her keep her sister away from the other two women. He agreed and returned to Philadelphia with Minnie. Sometime later, he got the idea to send Minnie to Baltimore for the piano player position to further distance her from the other two women. Grace also claimed that the only way to his room in Washington, D.C. was to pass by the dining room. Witnesses testified that an older resident had been sick on the night of the alleged events, and other residents were treating her throughout the night in the dining room. Therefore, Grace asserted it was unlikely that Minnie could have gone to his room in the middle of the night without being noticed. After a couple of months in Baltimore, a church member reported that there were issues with Minnie. The member had found out that Minnie was pregnant and even claimed to have caught her trying to cause her own miscarriage using an at-home remedy. When Grace came back to Baltimore, he gave Minnie some money and told her to go back to Brooklyn. Several months later, Lucille contacted Grace asking for more money, explaining that her sister was pregnant and was struggling to make ends meet. Grace sent money, but told the court that this was something he had done for many other members of his church. At one point, he even asked Lucille to give her sister a portion of the Brooklyn House of Prayer collection. He later learned that Minnie was claiming that he was the father of her child. Other witnesses testified to Minnie's character. Several accused her of having a sexual relationship with a House of Prayer minister named Daniel Lewis. Some of these witnesses claimed that she had been pregnant before her trip with Grace. Others said that Daniel Lewis was telling members that he was the father of Minnie's baby. Still others reported that she was known to be promiscuous. One man named Calvin Davis said that he had paid her for sex in November of 1932. Another man named Robert Milling said that he his wife, and Minnie had all slept together in New York in the spring of 1933. Other accusations included Minnie having relationships with married men. The prosecution countered with their own accusations against Daddy Grace. After Grace claimed that he had never had sex with any member of his church, the plaintiff's lawyer brought a Caucasian woman into the courtroom named Ella Wilkes, who was rumored to have birthed another son named Jeremiah by Grace. Grace admitted that he knew the woman and that she had been involved in the church in the early 1920s. But Grace denied being the father of Jeremiah. Grace had arranged for 11-year-old Jeremiah to stay in Philadelphia with a friend and was providing money for his care. When the prosecutor asked why he was taking care of the child financially, Grace again characterized his help as routine assistance to church members in need. Ella Wilkes refused to testify at the trial. State attorneys claimed that Grace had asked her not to testify when he saw her in the courtroom hallway. Grace denied this. Daniel Lewis also didn't testify. Lewis had left the church in August of 1933, allegedly due to a financial disagreement. However, research into another religious group might reveal a clue about the real reason for Lewis's departure. A researcher visited the Philadelphia group called Church of the Living God, the Pillar Ground of Truth for All Nations, which was founded by a man named Frank Cherry. The researcher interviewed a man known only as D.L. The man was married and said he was a former minister of the House of Prayer. He said that he had left the House of Prayer when leadership demanded that he take the rap for an offense committed by a leader. The alleged offense was described as some trouble over a girl. Could this DL have been Daniel Lewis? Was he referring to the accusations made by Minnie Campbell? The truth about Daniel Lewis may never be known. In the end, the trial's verdict would be decided based on whether Grace had taken Minnie across state lines for illicit sexual purposes. The allegations about sexual assault, illegitimate children, and polyamory amongst members were not at the center of the case. The jury found Daddy Grace guilty, and he was later sentenced to 1 year and a day of prison time. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal, and he paid a $7,500 bond to be released. Shortly after leaving prison to await the conclusion of his appeal, Daddy Grace was arrested again, this time for failure to pay child support. He once again paid a bond and was released. The House of Prayer membership closed ranks. They refused to speak to the press about the case. Daddy Grace held events in defiance of the charges. His first was in Newport News at the Ivy Avenue House of Prayer. Days later, he visited Norfolk. In his speeches to crowds of hundreds of supporters, he compared his situation to the way that Jesus was unjustly prosecuted. At an Easter Sunday parade, 10,000 people across many auxiliaries and bands proudly marched to support their bishop. Followers' beliefs that God was on Grace's side and that he was an innocent man being targeted by an ungodly world were confirmed when a family court ruled that Grace was not the father of Minnie Campbell's child. A doctor testified at the hearing that Minnie's baby was born at full term and therefore had been conceived in October and not November when Grace claimed he had traveled with Minnie. Of course, if Minnie's testimony that the pair had traveled in October was true, then the doctor's story would have corroborated her account. In any case, it appears that the judge accepted Grace's testimony that the pair's travel had happened in November and therefore the full-term baby could not have been conceived at that time. In response to an appeal of Grace's conviction under the Mann Act, the court overturned the jury's decision on a technicality after concluding that there had been jurisdictional issues with the case. Minnie's testimony in the paternity hearing had deviated from the one she had given at the first Mann Act trial. Prosecutors felt that she had lost credibility. They declined to refile the charges against Daddy Grace. In 1937, Daddy Grace divorced his second wife, Angelina. Years later, in 1954, another woman named Lavinia Royster filed a civil suit for spousal support, claiming that Grace had married her in 1923, fathered her daughter, and then left the family. At the time of the alleged hearing, Lavinia testified that Daddy Grace was using a fake name, John Royster. After the wedding night, she said that they had lived separately for some time before reuniting in Philadelphia in 1926. While in Philadelphia, she said that Grace took on yet another name, James E. Morris. Lavinia's daughter was born in 1927 and her husband left shortly after. According to Lavinia, the next time she saw her husband was in 1933 at a religious meeting in Waycross, Georgia, where he was giving a sermon under the name of Bishop Grace. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, she claimed to have had sporadic meetings with him where he promised to find a way to support her and her daughter. As evidence of her claims, Lavinia presented a letter which she claimed was written by Grace to their alleged daughter. The court found this letter to be generic and impersonal. Maybelle and Mammy Royster testified that they were relatives of Grace and that he had been raised on a farm in North Carolina. However, Grace's team presented a Portuguese passport, which showed he had traveled abroad shortly after the passport was issued in 1923. Two of Grace's sisters and a niece confirmed that he had immigrated to the United States from Portugal and had not grown up in North Carolina, as the Royster team's witnesses had claimed. After 12 days of testimony, the judge ruled in Daddy Grace's favor and dismissed the suit. Grace's legal victories became a core part of his appeal to his members. They compared their leader to the biblical figure named Joseph, who the Bible said was imprisoned due to false accusations from a woman. By the time Grace decided to buy the Peace Mission's headquarters in Harlem, he had consolidated his movement and became adept at its financial and legal complexities. Father Divine, meanwhile, faced legal trouble several years after those of Daddy Grace and was caught off guard at his rival's ability to evict him from his headquarters. Father Divine never let the media know how much Daddy Grace had weakened his movement. After the eviction, Father Divine adopted Daddy Grace's approach and began buying property in his own name. He incorporated the Peace Mission movement for the first time, establishing himself as its legal leader. In the ensuing years, Daddy Grace would continue buying properties near Peace Mission movement locations and provoking Father Divine in the press. Through the use of these high-profile headline-catching tactics, Daddy Grace grew the House of Prayer into a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. On January 12, 1960, Bishop Grace had a heart attack. 4 days later, he died. The church scheduled public viewings across 6 cities. Thousands of mourners came to pay their respects. The last destination for his body was none other than New Bedford, Massachusetts. His body was placed in a temporary vault while construction of a mausoleum was in progress. Little did anyone know, the process of putting Daddy Grace in his final resting place would take 4 long years. The death of the bishop threw the House of Prayer into chaos. As the sole leader of the organization, Daddy Grace was the only person with full knowledge of all the bank accounts, real estate arrangements, and other details for the church. Grace's personal affairs were equally mysterious. In a will written in November of 1948, he left money to his 4 siblings, his 2 children, Irene and Marcelino, Irene's 3 children, and his nieces Marie, Mildred, and Olive. The total amount of the inheritance was tens of thousands of dollars instead of the millions of dollars amassed by Grace during his lifetime. Irene and Marcelino were insulted by the figure and contested the will in court. Grace's ex-wife Jeannie was left out of the will entirely. She also sued. Jeannie and Irene's case were ultimately settled for a couple $100,000. Marcelino's case was dismissed. All remaining amounts and properties in Daddy Grace's estate were left to the church. While this prevented the church from having any problems retaining the buildings that Grace had purchased, the large inheritance attracted numerous lawsuits. Grace's niece Marie fought a lawsuit claiming that she was owed tens of thousands of dollars for services rendered. His other niece Mildred claimed in court that she had temporarily transferred property to Grace for safekeeping before his death, and that this property had inadvertently been left to the church in the will. A nurse working at one of the church's properties sued, claiming she had been injured due to inadequate building maintenance. The New Bedford School Board tried to use eminent domain to seize one of the church's properties to build a new school. The largest suit against the church came from none other than the IRS. The IRS claimed that Grace had failed to pay over $5 million in income tax and froze all of his personal and corporate assets. The agency would later settle for $1.9 million from the church. One reason that the IRS may have initially expected that Grace owed a larger amount of taxes was due to the opaque, mysterious nature of the House of Prayer's assets. Outside observers estimated that the church was worth anywhere from $16 million to $25 million, but no one could confirm a precise figure. After Grace's death, 2 executors named in his will declined to serve, prompting the court to appoint 2 lawyers to act in their stead. After months of investigation, the executors concluded that Grace's personal estate was worth around $700,000 and consisted primarily of real estate, After inheritance taxes, payments to heirs, and legal expenses, the remaining amount was left to the house of prayer. The church's finances wouldn't be evaluated until later. The process of picking a successor was just as difficult as sorting out Grace's financial situation. The Council of State Chairmen, which consisted of the elders across all 8 of the church's districts, voted to select Walter McCullough from Washington, D.C. as interim leader. Weeks later, in a formal election, McCullough was again selected. Walter McCullough was from North Carolina and joined the church in Charlotte in the early 1930s as a teenager. He held roles as a male usher, grace soldier, and elder, and later trained as a pastor before becoming a senior minister in Washington, D.C. By the 1950s, McCullough was the owner of a dry cleaning business and a full-time leader of the M Street House of Prayer in D.C. He was married with children. He was also a Prince Hall Mason. Before being elected to lead the House of Prayer, most members would have described McCullough as conservative. However, once he rose to leadership, he grew his hair and nails long, began wearing flashy clothing, and began an extensive touring schedule to churches around the country. This shift into a more Daddy Grace-like persona helped McCullough receive acceptance throughout the church. However, there were some leaders who were not happy. A faction of church leaders defected and filed a lawsuit claiming that McCullough's election had violated the church's bylaws. A judge agreed and further determined that the church still needed to get its finances in order. The judge placed the House of Prayer in receivership and barred McCullough from making appearances or referring to himself as Daddy, Sweet Daddy, Bishop, or Chief Official of the church. McCullough also lost access to the church's funds. An African-American attorney named William Bryant was appointed by the court to determine the proper election procedures, assess church property, and manage the church's finances until a new leader could be properly elected. At the time, Bryant was the first Black attorney to be appointed as receiver over an organization so large with so many assets. Bryant's work opened the door for other Black attorneys to perform the same role in future cases. McCullough ignored the court's prohibitions and continued to act as de facto leader of the church. The church's leaders who initiated the lawsuit complained to the court, and McCullough was held in contempt. In 1962, when William Bryant convened another election, Walter McCullough was once again overwhelmingly elected. Out of a total of 462 votes, McCullough received 410. One of his first acts as legally recognized bishop was excommunicating those who had filed a lawsuit against the church's first election. These pastors later established a splinter group called True Grace Memorial House of Prayer. This group maintained a more decentralized organization with less emphasis on the bishop role. After the election, Bryant continued his work assessing the church finances and reporting his findings. By 1963, he had concluded that the net worth of the church was around $4.5 million, approximately $3.2 million of which was in real estate. Bryant concluded his work as receiver, and control of the church and its finances were handed over to Daddy McCullough. The new leader used the turmoil from the transition process as a catalyst to strengthen the organization's election procedures, accounting practices, and corporate structure. While Daddy McCullough adopted many elements of Daddy Grace's style, he changed the organization in many ways. Large parades were scaled back. A new event called Spiritual Hurricane was created and emphasized prayer healing. However, McCullough never claimed that he was able to heal people himself. The new leader also took a more public stance on social issues by promoting clean living and admonishing the youths to stay away from drugs. The financial strategy under McCullough shifted slightly to focus less on headline-grabbing property acquisitions and more on projects that would directly benefit church members. In 1971, the bishop established the McCullough Scholarship Fund. He also created the McCullough Seminary, which hosted a one-year spiritual training program to prepare young men for leadership within the House of Prayer. Daycare centers and old age homes were opened. A new church auxiliary called the Coalition of Concerned Citizens offered tutoring, hosted food banks, and provided other services. When Bishop McCullough died in March of 1991, a new leader, Samuel Madison, was elected 2 months later. Once again, conflict ensued. Out of 570 votes, Madison received 360. Most of the remaining votes went to Walter McCullough's son, Charles Leon McCullough. Eventually, Charles was stripped of his preaching credentials when elders cited his continued refusal to respect Sweet Daddy Madison as bishop. Walter McCullough's wife, Clara, sued the organization, claiming that some of her personal property had been wrongly awarded to the church. She also had her husband's body exhumed and reburied in a private family plot when she learned that the church-provided plot would not have room for her. The work McCullough had done to clean up the organization's structure wasn't enough to prevent schisms and clashes during periods of leadership transition. Madison's leadership would last from 1991 to 2008. During this time, more members came forward with complaints about mismanagement and corruption. In 1994, the family of Elder Alfred Harrison sued the House of Prayer when they refused to allow him to have his funeral at the church. The family had donated over $500,000 during Harrison's lifetime, but because the elder had complained about the lack of financial transparency within the church and questioned the election of Sweet Daddy Madison, he was excommunicated. Family members were physically banned from entering the church, a ban which still continues to this day.
He don't leave you ignorant. He got him there plain as day. You can check yourself. You can check your heart. You know when you got love in your heart or not. You know when you love your enemy or not. You know whether you are doing God's will or not. You know when you're right, when you're wrong. And if you don't know you're right or wrong, find a house of prayer preacher. Come towards it. Oh, Mr. Preacher, I need some help. And if he can't help you, send them to Daddy.
In 2008, when Bishop Madison died, a man named Ronald Belton was working as his right-hand man. In a lawsuit filed in 2013, Ronald claims that Madison had become incompetent as early as 2005, and his wife Dolores Beale Madison secretly took over leadership. Because women cannot become daddy over the House of Prayer, Dolores allegedly formed an alliance with an Augusta, Georgia leader named Clarence Bailey. Belton's wife, Gina Belton, worked as Bailey's live-in cook. According to Ronald, Dolores used her influence to position Clarence Bailey as the organization's next leader so that she could maintain indirect control over the organization.
Witness for God, sing it with me. Lord, he touched.
Ronald Belton preached his whole life for the United House of Prayer.
I was born and raised in the church.
He was the church's national evangelist.
To bring thee.
So when he got prostate cancer, he asked Bishop Bailey for help.
His words were, "You knew this day was coming, you should have saved you some money." I was deeply hurt.
Ronald Belton clashed with Bishop Bailey. The bishop stripped him of his church credentials, according to a lawsuit filed by Belton.
I was excommunicated.
Why? He says it was because he let a woman walk too close to the bishop's throne, a kind of holy of holies called Daddy's Mountain.
Some members became emotional that she's on Daddy's Mountain.
And when Belton tried to visit a United House of Prayer earlier this year, the visiting preacher, one of Bailey's men, called him a clown right from the pulpit.
Ronald McDonald, clown. So I'm putting it out there. If you let Ronald Belly mess your mind up, you crazy.
They make it so uncomfortable because there are a lot of statements that have been made by the bishop that I was the evil one.
Dolores and Clarence supposedly became hostile towards Ronald due to his popularity throughout the House of Prayer. In 2012, the conflict hit an all-time high. Ronald was fired and excommunicated after Daddy Bailey accused him of allowing a woman to walk too closely to the holy mountain. However, Gina Belton was allowed to remain a member in good standing. Ronald claims that leaders used their knowledge about problems in his household and approached Gina with an offer to pay off her mortgage if she divorced Ronald. The Beltons later divorced. Ronald Belton testified in court that his wife now had millions of dollars which had been given to her by the church. Bishop Daddy Bailey increased the focus on tithing. A new auxiliary called Daddy's Club was formed, with dues starting at $2,000. Once admitted, members of Daddy's Club must ensure that they give large love offerings to the bishop. If members are in the bishop's presence at a church event, they may press cash money into his hand. This is the only time members of the church are allowed to touch the bishop. Tithing auctions are held. Members will yell out amounts that they wish to give to the bishop, and the highest bidder wins. However, all amounts, even those that were not the highest, are still collected. Bishops control millions of dollars of real estate. Most of the large homes remain vacant throughout the year, but are maintained by full-time staff. Those who give the most money are ranked in an organization-wide top 10 list. The pressure to get and stay on this list is so great that some have resorted to criminal activities. Member Ephonia Green was sentenced to time in federal prison for embezzling $5.1 million from her employer. While Green spent most of the money on cars, clothes, and other luxury items for herself, she gave over $1 million to the House of Prayer. Her conviction did not result in any church discipline. On August 11, 2023, while presiding over the 98th annual Holy Convocation of the House of Prayer, Bishop Bailey died. On October 13th of that year, Bishop the Honorable A.D. Cunningham was elected as the leader of the House of Prayer. Was Daddy Grace a grifter who used religion as a business opportunity, or was he a spiritual leader sent by God? The answer to those questions will be different based on who you ask. Like the Catholic Church, the House of Prayer had centralized leadership, rituals, and opulent aesthetics. Like the mainstream Black church, the preaching style, music, and culture was influenced by the experiences of Black people in America. To the confusion of many, members gained pride from watching their donations facilitate the acquisition of property and the lavish lifestyle for their leaders. Contemporary critics of the House of Prayer first dismissed it as a cult and later conflated it with other movements. They assumed it would die out after the bishop's various scandals or after his death. They were wrong. It turns out that Daddy Grace's choices for his movement were decisive. By not claiming to be God, his followers were not confused or disillusioned with the church after he died. Leadership transitions weren't easy, but they were possible within the movement's theology. He also left almost all of his wealth to the church, despite the fact that he had his own biological children. These assets continue to support the church to this day and secure the bishop's control of the leadership ranks. The rules for the House of Prayer have remained the same since its inception. Pay your tithes and never question the law of grace.